World Cup defeat sparks social media storm as African fans trolled South Africa over xenophobia concerns. The usual wave of African solidarity that often accompanies the FIFA World Cup was noticeably absent when South Africa kicked off its World Cup campaign against Mexico. Now it's time to break down every angle of this story on our AI podcast.
Imagine your national team takes the field for the biggest sports tournament on Earth. You are playing on the global stage, representing not just your country, but arguably your entire continent.
Right, the stakes are just absolutely massive. You expect everyone back home to be cheering.
Exactly. But instead of cheering you on, your neighboring countries flood the internet with the opposing team's flag. They adopt the opposing team's culture, their music, their food.
All in this massive coordinated effort to publicly root against you.
Yeah, which is exactly what happened to South Africa during their opening match against Mexico. I mean, the unwritten rule of global sports is that you root for your geographic neighbors when your own team isn't playing right.
Oh, definitely. We expect sports to be this unifying, border-erasing phenomenon.
But looking at the source material we are diving into today, excerpts from a piece titled Football, Xenophobia, and the Fracture of African Unity, we see that feel-good narrative just completely dismantled.
Yeah, it really is. A standard 90-minute football match managed to become a continent-wide digital protest.
Which is wild, because we often view sports as an escape from geopolitical tension.
Right, but the reality is that sports are frequently a mirror held up to those exact tensions. When South Africa, affectionately known as Bafana Bafana, stepped onto the pitch, they weren't just carrying a football legacy.
They were carrying a lot more than that.
Exactly. They were carrying the weight of shifting continental politics, deeply fractured loyalties, and a brewing socioeconomic crisis that the rest of the continent decided they could no longer ignore.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really understand how that frustration erupted, we need to look at the immediate flashpoint, which is the match itself.
Right. South Africa suffers a disappointing 2-0 defeat to Mexico.
Yeah, picking up 2 red cards in the process. It's a rough game.
Very rough. But the actual story happens entirely off the pitch, in the digital spaces where African football fans congregate.
Because African social media didn't rally around the defeated team at all. They flooded the internet with the support for Mexico.
Yeah, users posted Mexican flags, sombreros, mariachi bands, and, tacos.
People were adopting Spanish-themed usernames, too. And they were rallying under a highly specific hashtag, which was Mexico versus xenophobia.
The visual dissonance of that is just striking. I mean, you are scrolling through an African football forum expecting post-match analysis, and instead you are hit with a wall of mariachi memes.
It's like a family Thanksgiving where everyone suddenly roots for a rival high school team just to spite one specific sibling. I mean, is this just standard internet trolling, or is there a highly coordinated message being sent here?
What's fascinating here is that this is a deliberate weaponization of humor.
Wow, okay. How so?
Well, social media users across the continent were using the visual language of Mexican culture as a digital pressure valve. They bypassed formal diplomatic channels and state-sanctioned media to deliver a highly visible critique of South Africa's domestic policies regarding migrants.
Because humor, especially meme culture, is incredibly difficult for authorities to censor or spin. It doesn't look like a traditional political protest.
Exactly. It slips right past the defenses.
And it hacks the algorithm, too. You see a sombrero meme in a thread about a South African red card, and you stop scrolling because it feels so out of place.
Right. It forces you to engage.
Yeah.
There is a quote from an ex-user in the text that captures the core sentiment perfectly. They wrote, "You want people to cheer for you when you play soccer just because we're African."
Wow. That is so direct.
Yeah, that phrase, "just because we're African," is the crux of the entire conflict. It questions the historical bedrock of Pan-African solidarity.
Because for decades, particularly during the mid-20th century anti-colonial movements, Pan-Africanism was this vital unifying ideology.
Right. It was the idea that the destiny of all African nations was intertwined. An attack on one was an attack on all.
And South Africa specifically held a revered place in that ideology. After the fall of apartheid in 1994, the country was viewed as the ultimate victory of that shared solidarity. They were the beacon.
But this ex-user is saying that the era of unconditional solidarity is over. They are linking their refusal to support Bafana Bafana directly to ongoing reports of migrant mistreatment within South Africa.
So the message is basically, you cannot treat our citizens poorly within your borders from Monday to Friday and then expect us to wear your jersey on Saturday.
Exactly. I mean, An internet joke doesn't catch fire across an entire continent unless there's an ocean of gasoline underneath it.
Right, the mariachi band memes are pointing to an incredibly stark economic reality. So we need to look at the domestic situation driving that Mexico versus xenophobia hashtag.
Well, because South Africa positioned itself as that beacon of development post-1994, it naturally attracted a massive influx of migrants from across the continent.
People seeking employment, safety, and better opportunities, right?
Right. But the South African economy they arrived in is currently facing severe systemic challenges. The national unemployment rate has remained stubbornly above 30%.
Oh, wow. I have a hard time even conceptualizing 30% unemployment on a national scale. That is a massive structural level of idle hands and economic anxiety.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the source notes that some domestic groups in South Africa have started laying the blame for this crisis squarely at the feet of foreign nationals.
Migrants are being blamed for job shortages, for a rise in crime, and for straining public services.
Yeah. And it has escalated to the point where anti-migrant groups issued a June 30th deadline for undocumented foreigners to leave the country.
So that domestic tension is exactly what the rest of the continent was reacting to during the football match.
Exactly. There's a viral post from a South African user that hits right at the center of this. They said, "We're supporting Mexico so that South Africa can go back home early to protect their jobs."
Ouch. That is a devastatingly sharp comment.
Because it weaponizes the domestic political rhetoric and applies it to the football team, it reflects a very real, very dangerous environment.
But critics of this anti-migrant sentiment, both inside and outside of South Africa, point out that blaming foreigners for systemic economic failure completely lacks empirical evidence.
Right. They argue that this kind of rhetoric is not just false, it's a catalyst. It directly contributes to the repeated waves of physical intimidation, mob violence, and xenophobic attacks that we have seen erupt in the country.
I want to challenge that interpretation of the domestic response, though. I mean, it is very easy for critics on the outside to label this pure xenophobia and view the digital protest as righteous defense of migrants.
Okay, point.
But looking at the structural reality, a nation sitting at over 30% unemployment isn't a collision inevitable. When a third of a country's workforce cannot feed their families, the friction over resources is no longer an abstract moral failing. It is a mathematical certainty.
That's a grim way to look at it, but yeah.
You put millions of desperate citizens next to millions of incoming migrants in a stagnant economy, and that frustration is going to boil over whether the government wants it to or not.
I mean, inevitability does not equal justification. And that is where the danger lies.
Right. That makes sense.
But you are absolutely right that the socioeconomic pain is real, and the competition for scarce resources is a powder keg. Historically, though, when a nation faces an unsolvable internal crisis, turning the anger toward an easily identifiable outside group is the oldest political deflection tactic in the book.
Because it doesn't actually solve the problem.
Exactly. It doesn't build a single new factory or create a single new job. It just redirects the violence downward.
South African President Cyril Ramaphosa is caught trying to manage this exact tightrope.
Yeah, because he has to acknowledge that citizens have legitimate, pressing concerns about the sheer volume of migration and border enforcement.
He cannot ignore the economic reality you just described. But simultaneously, he's pleading with citizens not to take the law into their own hands.
Trying to suppress vigilante groups issuing arbitrary deadlines.
Right. He's trying to maintain the state's monopoly on the rule of law while the ground is essentially shaking beneath his feet. And football just happened to be the arena where all of that pressure found a release valve for the international community to witness.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. What makes this source so compelling is that it takes us out of the realm of abstract economic theory and anonymous internet memes and puts us directly into physical spaces.
Oh, the fan parks, yes.
Yeah. It explores how this ideological fracture plays out face-to-face, specifically in fan parks where people are watching the game shoulder to shoulder.
Because the dynamic completely shifts when you lose the shield of a digital avatar. The text details a scene at a fan park all the way in Atlanta, Georgia.
African diaspora fans physically living in the United States, gathering to watch the continent's representative on the world stage. And the fracture from the internet is physically present in that room.
Right. The source introduces Daniel Kaniki, a Congolese football fan. He is openly supporting Mexico, and his reasoning really strips away the politics and gets to the emotional core.
What did he say?
He says, Africa is like one country, and if one is chasing others, We are not a family anymore. That's why I'm supporting Mexico today.
Wow. So he views the anti-migrant violence back on the continent not as a failure of immigration policy, but as a fundamental betrayal of kinship.
It's a profound heartbreak. The post-colonial dream of a united Africa feels entirely hollow to him when he sees fellow migrants being hunted in the streets of Johannesburg.
But sitting in that very same fan park in Atlanta is Van Leerquist, a Ghanaian supporter, and he takes the exact opposite stance.
Yeah, he is fully backing South Africa.
Right, he emphasizes continental solidarity, saying, "I'm a proud African." His argument is that the anti-migrant violence only reflects the behavior of a radical minority, and it is unfair to condemn the entire nation or the national football team for the actions of a few.
That debate in Atlanta is a perfect microcosm of the broader identity crisis facing the continent. You have the deeply ingrained historical ideal of Pan-African loyalty actively clashing with the modern violent realities of resource scarcity.
It raises such a difficult question for the diaspora. I mean, does your loyalty lie with the geographic concept of the continent you left behind? Or does it lie with the human rights of the individual migrants currently living there?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it gets even more complex when the source moves from the diaspora in Atlanta to a fan park in Juba, the capital of South Sudan.
Oh, right. The atmosphere there is entirely different. The support for Bafana Bafana is rock solid.
Yeah, no mariachi memes, no divided loyalties.
A 23-year-old student named George Kenny Charles Rehan expressed genuine confusion and disappointment at seeing other Africans support Mexico. He says, "As South Sudanese, we are behind South Africa and will continue to support South Africa because they are representing Africa. All African countries must support South Africa."
To understand that unwavering support, you really have to understand South Sudan's specific historical context. They are the world's newest nation, having gained independence only recently after a brutal, decades-long civil war. For a young nation born out of a liberation struggle, South Africa's historical fight against white minority rule and apartheid is not ancient history. It is a parallel blueprint.
So South Africa represents the ultimate triumph of African liberation to them.
Exactly. Their loyalty is to the symbol of what South Africa achieved in the past, completely insulated from the migrant disputes happening in the present.
If you look at the board, the irony is staggering. I mean, a newly formed nation like South Sudan, which is grappling with its own massive internal conflicts and economic struggles, feels this unbreakable historical allegiance to South Africa's legacy.
While diaspora fans living thousands of miles away in the relative safety of Atlanta are hyper-engaged in a bitter argument over South Africa's current human rights record.
It proves how heavily your geographical and historical vantage point dictates your reality. There is no monolith. There is no single African perspective on this football match.
The continent is actively negotiating its modern identity in real time, and the football pitch just happens to be the canvas they are using.
But while fans in Atlanta and Juba are debating the philosophy of unity, the governments of these nations do not have the luxury of philosophical debate, right?
No, not at all. They are reacting to the immediate security threats generated by this friction. The contrast between the official government statements and the actual diplomatic actions taken is where the severity of this crisis becomes undeniable.
Yeah, because after the 2-0 loss, the South African government releases a statement. And it is standard, polished public relations. They praise Bafana's spirited performance.
They emphasize that the players represented the country with unity, determination, and pride on the world stage. They are trying to project strength and normalcy.
And you see South African citizens fiercely defending that narrative online, circling the wagons. One user writes, "We qualified for the World Cup alone without your support, and whether we win or lose, we will remain South Africans who love their country."
Another adds, "They can support Mexico all they want. We are not backing down. Come to South Africa legally."
That phrase, "come to South Africa legally," is such a strategic pivot.
It really is. It attempts to strip away all the accusations of xenophobia and reframe the entire conflict strictly as a matter of border sovereignty and the rule of law.
It's a defense mechanism aimed at domestic voters as much as the international community. But that projection of national pride and legal order stands in a jarring, almost surreal contrast to the frantic logistical actions being taken by their neighbors.
Because while South Africa is putting out press releases about football unity, the governments of Nigeria, Ghana, Zimbabwe, and Malawi are quietly initiating emergency repatriation efforts.
Wait, really?
Yes, they are literally chartering flights to pull their citizens out of South Africa. They aren't debating memes. They were looking at the escalating anti-migrant threats on the ground.
Looking at the vigilante deadlines and deciding the environment is too dangerous for their people to remain.
Exactly. Chartering repatriation flights is a massive, expensive, and diplomatically aggressive maneuver. It is a blatant vote of no confidence in South Africa's ability to protect foreign nationals.
So what does this all mean? I mean, you cannot issue a press release about Pan-African pride while your neighbors are running emergency evacuation operations from your major cities. The disconnect is absolute.
It is two completely different realities trying to occupy the same geopolitical space. Prominent figures are watching this disconnect and calling it out publicly, ensuring the government can't just sweep it under the rug.
Like who?
The source highlights a comment from Ahmed Nasir Abdullahi, a highly influential Kenyan lawyer and political commentator. He posts, "I hope South Africa is not blaming African migrants for the 2-0 defeat and 2 red cards in the match against Mexico."
Oh, wow. That is a brilliant piece of digital diplomacy.
On the surface, it is a sarcastic football joke. But structurally, it takes a highly respected legal mind and applies their influence to amplify a grassroots digital protest.
He is using the mechanics of a football loss to publicly humiliate a neighboring government over their internal human rights failings.
Exactly. When the geopolitical protest infiltrates the mainstream commentary like that, the state has entirely lost control of the narrative.
It's just wild. We started this conversation looking at a 2-0 defeat on a football pitch. But by analyzing the reaction to that loss, we have uncovered a massive continent-wide reckoning.
Yeah, we've explored how a stagnant economy with 30% unemployment acts as a catalyst, transforming historical alliances into bitter anti-migrant resentment.
And we have seen how the legacy of Pan-African solidarity, a concept that helped dismantle colonial rule, is fracturing under the weight of modern economic survival.
We have also witnessed a fundamental shift in how international grievances are aired. Digital platforms have armed everyday citizens with the ability to bypass formal state narratives.
Right. By using the universal language of sports and the viral nature of internet humor, they can orchestrate a highly visible, highly effective international protest that forces global attention onto domestic human rights issues.
Which proves that the mechanics of diplomacy are changing. The most effective geopolitical protests don't necessarily require formal summits or United Nations resolutions anymore.
They can be launched from a smartphone in a FAM park in Atlanta. They happen when someone changes their display name to a Spanish pun to protest a broken immigration system.
It's incredible.
For you listening, this demonstrates that if you want to understand the profound socioeconomic pain of a region, you often have to look right past the official statements and decode the internet culture bubbling beneath the surface.
And that reality leaves us with a critical thought moving forward. Our source concludes by noting that South Africa faces a monumental task in repairing these alienated regional relationships.
Yeah, it's not going to be easy.
But if digital culture has now permanently intertwined the performance of national sports teams with the domestic policies of their home countries, the implications are massive.
Definitely.
Think about it. Will a country's internal human rights records soon become as heavily scrutinized and debated by casual sports fans as a referee's bad call? What happens to the global landscape when the ultimate unifier, sports, evolves into the public's most devastating tool for international shaming?
That is a fascinating question. The next time you sit down to watch a major international tournament, take a close look at the crowd, both in the stands and online. If you see an entire region wearing the opposing team's colors, you aren't just witnessing a sports rivalry. You are looking at a real-time map of geopolitical fractures.
Okay, one question for you. How was the issue of xenophobia in South Africa influenced the way many African football fans viewed and supported teams during the World Cup, and what does this reveal about the relationship between sports and social issues? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.